And this is why Eliot says that the semi-ethical criterion of sublimity misses the mark. We don't read poetry to get in touch with the great soul of the great man, the great spirit of the great genius. That's not it. The poem has to be great not because of who wrote it, but because of the actual linguistic actions that have been performed within the poem. And we'll get into that when I talk about the metaphysical poets. But further down the page, Eliot says that what he's arguing seems in a way to challenge the metaphysical theory of the substantial unity of the soul. What's he getting at here? He's saying quite simply this, that the person who sat down to burn their eggs today versus the person who later will go on to write a poem, they may both have the name T.S. Eliot, or they may both have the same name. They're two different people. The person who is writing is one person, and then the guy or the woman who 2 hours later puts down the pen and walks off to the kitchen to make coffee, they're two different people. You have to stop being you. If you are you when you write, then you're not a poet. Sorry. So it's by going through this depersonalization process that valid new works of art come out, simply by producing gimmicks, novelties, trying to be creepier than the last horror movie, trying to be sexier than the last romance movie. Quantitative increases is going to be really the process of straining after greater secondary effects, and it's going to take you further and further away from what you actually want, to escape emotion so as to gain access to feeling. In the same paragraph, then he'll say, another thing that misses the mark is the phrase that poetry is emotion recollected in tranquility. Well, who does he have in mind there? Straight out of the preface by Wordsworth. Wordsworth says that what the poet wants to do is think back to key moments in his own life, reflect on them, remember the feelings that he had at that time, and then try to express them in the clearest language possible. And Eliot's like, this is a recipe for bad poetry because it's too personal, it's too self-absorbed. We don't do that at all. You never write about yourself. You write about other people. You have to assume some persona other than yourself, or what you're not. What you're writing is simply confession, and that's fine if you're a Catholic saint named Augustine, but that's of no interest to Eliot. So he'll say, poetry exists for the escape of emotion. For it's not expression of personality, but an escape from personality. And here's the zinger. But of course, only those who have personality and emotions know what it means to want to escape from these things. What's he saying right here? Quite frankly, most people aren't that interesting. Most people aren't that deep. Why would you want to escape from personality? You'll never know because you don't have a personality. Why would you want to escape from emotions? Because your emotions aren't even yours. They're just automatic responses which have been ingrained in you from years and years of being told what to read, told what to see at the movies, told what to listen to, either by critics or by bestsellers lists or by algorithms. So that, what most people consider to be their most powerful emotions are really just behavioral responses which have been conditioned into them. So I'll just say one last thing on this piece, and then I'll move on to the next one, and I'll try to make my description of that briefer because this is getting lengthy. But yeah, for Eliot, most people simply don't get it, and there's not much you can do to help them. But the poet, again, does not write to the masses. The poet writes to other poets. We call them a poet's poet, or in the realm of the visual, certain artists aren't really painting for the public. They're artists. And in the very end of the essay, he'll go back to this notion of impersonality, and he'll say that he is not likely to know what it is to be done, or what is to be done, unless he lives in what is not merely the present, but the present moment of the past, unless he is conscious not of what is dead, but what is already living. And here you could get confused. Well, I thought you said he was talking about, yeah, the dead are still alive. The dead are still alive, and we need to see them that way. But the only way we're going to be able to see that there is indeed a true social connection that we share with the dead is through being able to have good poets, valid poets in modern times, and to recognize good poetry when we see it. And that's what the metaphysical poet essay is going to be all about. It's going to be about teaching us what to look for in good poetry. And I'll move on to that now. So he talks about this guy, Professor Grierson, issuing an anthology, Oxford Book of English Verse. And in it, he's going to include a whole variety, a whole number of poets who have, going back a couple hundred years, been referred to as the metaphysical poets. They were called the metaphysical poets by a guy named Samuel Johnson, who gets mentioned in this essay. Who's Samuel Johnson? He's the guy who tried in the mid-18th century, the English Enlightenment, to make English, the English language and English literature sensible, rational, enlightened. So he's the first person to put out a dictionary of the English language, and he, as a critic, is trying to call for certain unities to be maintained in the literature of the day. So plots can't be fantastical where people are flying all over the place, but actions need to be meaningful. One needs to lead purposefully into the next. Characters should remain consistent, and the narration can't hop all over the place for unmotivated reasons. Every chapter, one after the other, has to move in a seamless flow so that things make sense. And it's this eminently sensible critic from the Enlightenment who looks back at what he considers to be the wild imaginative flights of a group of poets from the late 16th and early 17th century. They don't have any particular name for themselves. It's he who calls them the metaphysical poets. And he's using it as a term of disparagement. Because metaphysical means what? Not located in this world of the senses and common sense, but up, in outer space. So he calls them that as a term of abuse, and what prompts him to come up with this term is the fact that he says that they have a tendency to yoke by violence together incompatible images. So in a sonnet by John Donne or something like that, he could be looking at his wife's weeping eyes, and he can see a single drop of water in the form of a tear cascading down his face, and then immediately leap to the great flood that Noah escaped with the ark. And then in another one called The Flea, it's going to be John Donne looking at a flea biting him in the arm and watching the thing suck his blood and then thinking, wow, what if he were to bite my girlfriend? And then our blood would be commingled inside this little flea. So huge leaps of time, space, associative flights that to the eminently sensible Samuel Johnson look like the products of a frenzied mind. These people look insane. And so for him, you know, these poets, if to be read at all, are to be read with the understanding that they're pretty loony. And what Grierson is doing that Eliot finds so interesting and helpful is he's trying to bring these people who have fallen out of critical favor and who are only read by a select group of scholars. He's trying to suggest that these poets who you have relegated to the very corners of the canon, because, I mean, that's what the anthology is. It's going to be an attempt to look over the course of English literature and to pick out only what's best and contain it in a single volume. You know, these people have been excluded from such anthologies, excluded from the canon, and Grierson is saying you shouldn't have overlooked them. Eliot is reading this and saying, by God, you're right, but he's going to go one further and explain why these guys, not only why they were overlooked, but why they shouldn't have been overlooked, why they're actually really good. And you could then say, well, tell me what exactly these poets all have in common. And Eliot's really, really clear about this. Not a heck of a lot. You know, there may be a certain vague similarity amongst them, what we call, Wittgenstein called it, family resemblance, but there's not one specific characteristic which all of them have in common, which can be called, you know, the essence of metaphysical poetry, because again, they didn't call themselves that. This was a term of abuse which was created hundreds of years after the last of them died and was retroactively imposed upon them. When you actually get rid of the term metaphysical poetry and look at these poets, what is so interesting about them is the differences between them. Each one of them is using the English language in a way which is peculiar to them alone. And Eliot values this because what we're actually seeing here is what the English language, and I'll use the musical phrase, what the English countenance used to look like, or what the English voice used to sound like before it got denatured. And who denatured it? I won't say it was completely Samuel Johnson, but what he was doing by prescribing how characters must be developed, how plots must be developed, how metaphors can and can't appropriately be used so as to communicate clearly, rationally, and with common sense. What this is essentially said is everybody's got to write the same way. Everybody has to follow the same rules, and anything that might be eccentric to you and you alone, that's got to go. The language, and with the language, the English spirit has been homogenized. Now everybody's norm. And Eliot wants to go back to the metaphysical poets because they're going to show us what the English language looked like before it got standardized and dumbed down by people who thought they were smarter than previous generations. So these guys don't have anything in common other than the fact that they're using language in an unprogrammed, unstandardized fashion. Now, what happened that caused English poetry to what Eliot will call, we'll say of it, is fall into great decline. So he says at a certain point, the English language, especially as it was embodied in English poetry, goes through a tremendous decline. He'll talk about as the time of the Revolution, and it's unclear which revolution he means, because there was the English Revolution led by Cromwell when the Protestants took over from the Catholics and they beheaded Charles, set up their new model army and this Protestant theocracy. Well, not all of the aristocrats and not all the royal family got beheaded the way Charles did. They hightailed it out of the country and went into exile. Where did they go? They went to Holland, which was at that point in time an extremely wealthy and powerful republic. And all kinds of people with dangerous ideas went over there because it was relatively freer than just about anywhere else in Europe. So the royals and the aristocracy all go over to Europe. Eventually they're going to come back from exile, and then in what's called the Restoration, we get the Stuarts back on the throne. And then a little bit after that, there's the Glorious Revolution, in which William and Mary is part of the British royal family, and her husband, who is the Prince of Orange in the Netherlands, they sail up the Thames and without a single shot being fired essentially take over England. Now we've got the House of Orange. So the point that I think Eliot is trying to make, or at least noticing, is all of the best minds for a period of about 30 to 40 years left England under penalty of death. And when they went over to Holland, they became continental. They picked up a whole bunch of new ideas and eventually brought them back to England. But these were cultural, intellectual imports, which are not part of the English culture. One of the things that gets imported is going to be rationalist philosophy. So he wasn't Dutch, he was French, but he lived in Holland because he could be freer there. This was the philosopher René Descartes, who's the father of rational philosophy and mechanics of the sort that you learn in physics class. But what's Descartes' most famous statement? Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. He's going to build a new system of knowledge and launch modern science by saying that the most undisputable fact, in fact, it's entirely indisputable as far as he's concerned, is that I exist, and the reason I know I exist is because I think. Because if thinking is taking place, if I'm not doing it, there could be no thinking. So I must exist. Even if you try to deny your existence, in the very act of thinking that you don't exist, you only prove that you exist. My point here is that we become egocentric at this point. We become egotistical, and in keeping with Descartes' rationalist philosophy, which leads to his mechanistic description of the world, we begin to feel that we are preeminently entitled to control the world consciously through the cognitive process. We all become engineers. And what Eliot's going to argue is this is disastrous for poetry because it makes us what? It makes us feel that we are somehow in control of the writing process when we do it. And for us to be in rational control of the writing process is to say that we separate theory, which is to say conceptual thinking and planning. Remember I said we all become engineers, from the execution of those plans. They become two different things. Theory versus practice And what Eliot wants to suggest is this is completely inimical to art. What art should be, and this sounds a little bit like the practical ideas that Marcel Mauss talks about in his famous essay on magic. True spontaneous human experience, I'll use that word for lack of a better one, has to take place in such a way that theory and praxis perfectly overlap with one another. They become virtually indistinguishable. When this comes down to poetry, that means you can't think of a poem. You'll hear people say, I've got a great idea for a novel. As soon as you've got a great idea for a novel and you're just waiting for time to write it, you're already lost. You have to just sit down and think and write at the same time. Writing shouldn't be about actions that were performed in the past and now recollected in perfect tranquility, but the process of writing is an action unto itself, and the feelings which come across as you read a poem should be the feelings which emerge out of the language as the poet launches themselves into it without preconception of where this is going to go, what it's about. Great poetry is written in the form of improvisation, where the mind is working so quickly and so intensely that there isn't time to become self-conscious. Self-consciousness is going to be the death of creativity. And, for any of you who are performative artists, even if you're just, not a professional but an amateur, what's going to destroy your piano recital? You know as well as I, because we've all been there. You get self-conscious in the middle of the piece, and you start trying to play deliberately, and it's all over. All you can do is suffer through every mistake you make until the end of the piece, and then go home and weep. But the best performances that you've ever put in, whether it's performing music or composing music, people will ask you, what were you thinking about? You have no idea. You weren't there. You come out of this seeming trance state, and you've got no idea what you just wrote, because as Eliot was saying in the last essay, that you weren't there. It wasn't you. You were simply a vessel that was being used by some power that transcends your ability to control it. And to the extent that you do try to control it cognitively, consciously, egotistically, it's all over. So I'm not going to say too much more about this piece because I really don't want this to get out of control. But why is Eliot interested in this, amongst other things? Because he wants English culture to regain its character, and this can't happen if we're all consciously applying rules of composition. And although Eliot himself will say that he's no psychologist, and this is why he won't speculate on what's actually happening, he just knows that something is happening. To see the English language do what it does without being hindered or overridden by rules taken from other cultures. So it's against this kind of standardization that he's arguing. And where else are we seeing standardization in Eliot's own day? In psychology. So what people have been trying to do in the 19th century is figure out the nature of the human mind. And one of the ways they go about doing this is by creating this new field called experimental psychology. It's not that there wasn't psychology prior to the mid to the late 19th century, but it wasn't done in laboratories. And what you get, mostly in German-speaking countries, but also in the United States, is certain guys who are going to try to tell you what human nature looks like. And the way they're going to do this is by hooking people up to various instruments of measurement, and then in a controlled fashion, in an ideally neutral laboratory environment where we can modify one variable at a time, they're going to either shine brighter or dimmer lights at people, or play louder or softer noises, or higher or lower pitches. And, they can do tactile experiments too, but the whole time they're doing this, they're trying to do what? Figure out the entire range of the human sensorium, or the human neurological network. So at what frequency can humans begin to hear a pitch? And at what frequency does it become too high for them to hear? We're going to play various pitches at people, in a white cube, a totally neutral environment, and ask them, can you hear this? Can you hear this? Can you hear that? And we're going to map out their sensory range. And then once we're finished with this person, then we'll bring in another and another. And after we've conducted a large enough quantity of surveys, we're going to crunch all the numbers and come up with a model. We'll get a little function, a line on a graph that says this is what the human ear can do in this aspect. Then we might try playing like different timbres or what have you. And if you look online, you can see websites where, all the tuning forks that they were using, all of the various optical devices they were using to stimulate, to probe people and then measure their response, stimulus and response. They're all available to see on websites. But once they probe the human sensorium in every possible way using a broad enough sample of different subjects and then averaging them all out into a set of functions, they call this human nature. And it's the contention of certain people, in particular the philosopher / psychologist at Harvard named William James, who says, this doesn't teach you what human nature does. All this teaches you is what humans do in a laboratory. When you take somebody out of the real world, out of the life world, out of everyday experience where they behave the way they actually would, and then put them in this unbelievably artificial set of conditions, you don't find out what human nature is. You just find out what humans look like when they're subjected to laboratory experimentation. This isn't human nature at all. If you want to see what human nature really is, you've got to look at people not in the laboratory but out in the wild, and you've got to look at those people who are not just like everybody else. The average human doesn't tell you what human nature are, because humans are creative, exploratory creatures. So if you want to know what human nature looks like, you've got to find the weirdos. And where do you find the weirdos? You find them in religion. Why? Because these are the people who, against common sense, in defiance of everything that we consider to be correct and rational, go off and, live in the woods under a tree for 10 years talking to the birds. Or they lock themselves into dungeons and, for the love of Jesus or something like that. Or it's not the average person who lives that way. The average parishioner is as boring as the average laboratory subject. But the people who found religions or who found religious orders or who go on to become saints, those are people who do not compromise for anything. And when we look at them, we find out what? They're all different. They have not yet, their human nature is still diverse and colorful. It's not homogenized, it's not denatured, it's not neutralized. And so there's not, here's the title of William James' famous book. It was published in 1900 and it goes on, if you can believe certain sources, to be considered one of the greatest books of the 20th century. It's not called The Human Religious Experience. It's called The Varieties of Religious Experience. There's no such thing as only one religious experience. Religious experience by its nature is diverse and manifold. And what James is doing in the realm of psychology, Eliot is trying to call for in the realm of the arts. We want to see what the English countenance, what the English language looked like before everybody had been trained, conditioned to speak the same. Again, the downfall of the English language, and he says we've yet to recover from it, is sometime in the 17th century when we all become continental and we're all taught to act and think alike. But if you go back and read the metaphysical poets, each one of the wild metaphors, each one of the extended similes, each one of the expansions or contractions of time and space, all of the tropes and figures of speech that they are unashamed to use are simply individual instances of what a healthy human mind can do. So, far from being lunatics, these are the last sane speakers of the English language. They're speaking it in an unself-conscious, unashamed, spontaneous fashion, and this is what we need to get back to. Come the 17th century, as we start to become more self-conscious, having picked up continental ways, it's not that all poetry becomes absolutely wretched, but it does go into decline. And two of the people behind this entry into decline are as dangerous as they were precisely because they were excellent writers. And that's going to be Milton, who writes Paradise Lost. If you want to know what that is, it's the epic poem in which Milton tells the story of Genesis again in modern English. And then Dryden, Milton was a Protestant, Dryden was a Catholic and a courtier, but their styles are extremely different. One trying to ingratiate himself with the aristocracy, and the other trying to translate the Bible into the language of the people. They couldn't be more different from one another, but what they do have in common is they're both conscious writers. Each of them has a goal that they want to achieve or some vision of what they want to achieve before they sit down to write. So Milton, he's blind, and so he supposedly is possessed of higher visionary powers, but he's conceived his poem in advance before he sits down to write it or dictate it to his daughter. He's got an idea first, and then it's going to be executed. He's got a vision that he wants to translate into language. And then with Dryden, as a courtier, that means he's got to be a flatterer. He's got to do what? Know the political or the social effect that he wants to cause through speaking in flattering terms about this or that member of the royal household. He already has a preconceived notion of not what he's going to write, but of the effect that he wants his writing to have. So in both cases, they're reflective, and they take us farther away from the idea of writing as spontaneous human activity, which is free of engineered results and simply shows the mind unconsciously, unselfconsciously doing what it does. So those two are a step down, and as we finally get into the century prior to Eliot, we have poets like Tennyson and Browning, where the distance between thinking and feeling, between thinking and writing, has become so extreme that we've got poets who are doing the literary equivalent of what Tchaikovsky is doing with music, and that's producing wretched sentimentality. For Eliot, this is just about as bad as it gets. And for this reason, what we really need to do as readers and as writers in modern times is cleanse our palate of all of this wretched emotional excess and learn to think and feel in a fresh and healthy fashion. We've become besotted, we've become drunken with emotion, and in modern times, it just won't do, if it ever would at all. So the metaphysical poets become not just an example of what English writing looked like in its purity, but it also becomes models for the type of poetry that we want to produce in modern time, which is difficult and wildly associative, but that's what it's like to live in modern times. To be modern is to be at the nexus of all kinds of stimuli, all kinds of messages coming from hither and yon, from every point of the globe, all at the same time. Poetry must be wildly associative. It must show spontaneous activity of the mind, and the result is going to be difficult poetry. So I could say a little bit more about this, but I'm going to call it good for there. I've got a lot of hours of editing ahead of me, so I'm going to sign off for now, but I will edit these in just a little while, and I'll get them up as soon as I possibly can. So hope this was interesting to you. Good luck as you think back on Eliot a little bit, and good luck as you move on to the next set of readings. So, all right, good to see you guys today. Hope you're doing well. Hope you got your power back. You won't hear this unless you do. All right, take care. See ya.